All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 32, Section 4, Unequal Development and the Movement of Peoples. So one thing that we talked about last section, 32-3, was population growth. And that much of that population growth is going on in what we call developing nations as opposed to developed. It's a little bit confusing because they sound the same. Developing nations, generally speaking, are poor nations. Developed nations are generally rich, if that kind of helps you remember. And between 1975 and 2000, while it is accurate to say that between that time period, the world has experienced a faster and greater rise in the standard of living, really ever. It's also true that it's led to big differences between rich and poor. So economic expansion, we're going to say, modern economic expansion is the fastest and greatest in world history, right? That means things have gotten better for most people, or for the most people in the quickest amount of time ever, right? And that is certainly something that's remarkable. Again, one of the issues, however, is that while everybody is generally better off compared to 100 years ago, or compared to really any other time in world history, the difference between those who are rich and those who are poor is growing wider and wider and wider. So for example, typically the most common used tool to measure economic well-being is gross domestic product, or GDP. That is essentially the amount a nation creates divided by the population. Right, so you take pretty much all the goods and services that a country produces, you divide it by the population per person, and that's typically what you get. So for example, in the United States, the average is about $46,000 per year. There are nations that are much higher than that, but the United States, it's a good point of reference because there's a good chance that whoever's watching this is in the US. When compared to a country like Haiti and others, which is only 1,000. And so what this has led to is two trends, right? One is internal migration. Internal migration refers to migration inside of countries, right? Inside of countries. And global migration, which is migration between countries, right? So moving from one nation to another. In terms of internal migration, the most intense is being experienced in the developing nations. Again, using our sort of point of reference here, right? Generally countries that are not as good off. Even though it's true that in some of these nations there have been the fast and rapid growth of urban slums, which you might see illustrated here, that generally speaking, the cities offer economic opportunity, right? That for as bad as some of the cities may be in developing nations because of the overcrowding and the continuous influx of people moving there, generally speaking, there is still more economic opportunity in the cities than there is in the countryside. So by internal migration, we're talking about a rural to urban migration. And so, cities in places like China have grown really rapid recently. Some of the fastest growing cities today are in places like Africa and India, and this will continue to be a trend. Meanwhile, in terms of global migration, it is from developing nations to the developed. So, Europe, for example, United States. Let's see, United States. Right? These are the nations which are experiencing a lot of immigration from outside, right? Global migration. And what this has done is that it's created somewhat of a backlash. There are a lot of concerns, especially in countries in Europe and in the United States, about what the effect of immigration might be. This has manifested itself in various different types of anti-immigrant sentiment. There are questions regarding the pay of workers. So, for example, labor and workers' unions fear immigrant labor will depress wages, right? So if immigrants arriving to the United States and Europe are willing to work for less money, then that's going to put pressure on existing workers in the United States and Europe that they might not get paid as much as they did previously. And again, this sort of feeds in to some of the efforts to curtail or at least restrict immigration to some of these nations. There's also the fact that there's the cultural difference. It could be things like religion, it could be things like language also. And typically, many of the immigrant groups coming from developing nations have a very different demographic setup. That is where most developed nations, like we mentioned last section in 32-3, most developed nations have a very low fertility rate. High fertility is most common among immigrants. In developed nations.